Hey guys, this is Miss Beatty, and today we're going to review the Intro to Mythology section from English 9A on Edgenuity. Okay, so our goals for the lesson are to understand why a myth is told, identify the features of a myth, and summarize a story using beginning, middle, and end. Okay, so let's start with important vocabulary. Our first one is plot, okay? Plot is the events and conflicts that make up a story. All right, we're going to talk a little bit about all of these later, but just know plot is the events and conflicts that make up a story. Culture is the customs and beliefs of a group of people. All right, customs and beliefs of a group of people. A myth is a traditional story that explains a belief system, a natural phenomenon, or the worldview of a group of people. Phenomenon, as it was used right above in the myth definition, is an event or occurrence that doesn't have an easy explanation. And a summary is a statement of the central ideas of a story in your own words. We're going to be using some of these vocabulary words in our review, okay? So, on our next slide, we're going to talk about why do we tell stories, okay? If you even think about telling stories in your everyday life, these are the reasons why you might tell a story, okay? You might tell a story to entertain others, to make your friends laugh, okay? You might tell a story to warn other people about dangers. Say a local road was under construction and you were telling your parents, hey, like maybe don't go on that road right now because it's super dangerous and you have to slow way down for traffic. You might tell somebody a story to teach a lesson, okay? You might try to tell a story to explain a situation. Hey, this is what happened. I just want you to know the true story. And you might tell a story to share what's important to you. Okay, if you want to talk about your values, or just tell people a story about who you are and what motivates you, you might share a story to share what's important to you. So these are the 5 elements of why people tell stories, and they will come in handy later. Next, we need to take a look at what is a myth. A myth is one of the earliest stories ever told. Okay, it's a traditional story of a group of people that explains a belief system, a natural phenomenon, or the worldview of a group of people. Okay, so it might say might talk about a belief system. What do people believe in? Whether that's gods, or what do they believe about the world? A natural phenomenon. So it might say, what do people believe about how volcanoes erupt? What causes that? What causes the change of seasons? What causes people to act the way they do? A natural phenomenon. Or a story might explain the worldview of a group of people. So what do people believe about other people? Do they believe in things like family? Do they believe taking care of the planet is important? It explains the worldview of a group of people, okay? Some common mythical elements, and these are important, okay? So most to all myths have these things, okay? Supernatural beings is the first one. So gods or human-like animals. You might have unicorns, you might have fairies, you might see gods, minotaurs. It depends on the culture. Next, you'll have a fantasy setting. So places and things that are not real. So you might have a fantasy kingdom in the sky, or you might see like a character deep underground in hell or something like that. Places or things that you cannot see in the real world, okay? Myths might try to explain the origin of the universe or how something started. So it might say, so-and-so God created the universe using this, that, and this, okay? How the universe started. And then they also typically feature conflicts between worlds, people, conflicts between yourself, or conflicts with nature. Okay, so these are the 4 common mythical elements you'll see in myths. So to review, things that could be found in a myth might be something like a sky palace, a talking volcano, or a flying horse. Any story can have stuff like a clay pot, a hunting spear, or a crying baby. But what makes it a myth is that it has a fantasy setting, or a supernatural being like a talking volcano or a flying horse. Next, we're going to talk about the purpose of myths. And these are the ones we talked about a little bit before. It's why people tell stories. The purpose of myths are, again, to entertain others, to warn about dangers, to teach a lesson, to explain situations, and to share what's important to you. Okay, those are the 5 purposes of myths. So myths are a way sometimes to explain the unexplainable. They tell about a people's beliefs, values, or way of life. They might explain the creation of Earth, things, humans, animals, or nature. They might talk about human problems, feelings, or behavior. Remember, a long time ago, we didn't have like psychology or science to explain why things happened. So people explained all these things using myths. Or they might have people and gods sent to teach lessons, okay? So if we just looked at Moana, all right? Moana might, in that scene with Maui, he sings a song and he tells how he created coconuts and he created this and that and all that different stuff because he's a demigod. That's explaining the unexplainable. So Moana's people might not have known why certain things exist, but in their myths, they say that Maui created those things or other gods created those things, okay? We need to talk a little bit about plotting a myth, because at a certain point, you need to look at the beginning, middle, and end of the story to be able to write a summary, all right? Or tell somebody a summary. So, plotting a myth. The plot of a story includes all the events and conflicts that make up the story. In the beginning, you introduce the setting, the characters, and the conflict. So in Moana, that's where we get introduced to who Moana is, see her island, and learn about the conflict, the fact that Moana wants to leave her island and explore, but she can't. She's kind of bound there by tradition. The middle of the story is where the conflict builds and shows how the characters attempt to overcome obstacles. So in Moana, you see she sails and she meets Maui. They face off against that giant crab. She ends up losing Maui, etc. That's the middle of the story. And the end is where the conflict is resolved. Okay, so Moana does that dramatic walk and she offers the stone to the volcano, who we later find out is the goddess. And that's how she resolves the conflict, which is that her island was dying, but also the fact that she felt she wasn't able to explore her freedom and sail off the island. Okay, so beginning, middle, and end. So the conflict of a story is the problem in the story. So whenever you're reading a story, you might say, what is the problem here? And we have a chart here that kind of talks about the major conflicts in literature. Here are the main ones. Man versus nature is where the main character is fighting off against something in nature, whether that's natural phenomenon, whether that's things in nature like animals or whatever. Another popular one is man versus man. The main character is facing off against another person. Man versus self. The man or the main character in the story is facing off against their own inner thoughts or their own struggles, inner struggles. They're facing themselves. We also see man versus God occasionally, especially in myths. man versus the gods, or supernatural elements. Okay, so the conflict is the problem in the story, and you always need to figure out what's the problem in here, what's the conflict that needs to be resolved. So, plotting a myth. When you're summarizing a story, you need to find the central ideas and key details in the beginning, the middle, and the end. So as you're reading through the beginning of the story, notice your key ideas about the characters, the setting, and the conflict. In the middle, notice key ideas about how the conflict is building. And as you get to the end of the story, notice key ideas about how the conflicts are resolved. All right, so if we're thinking back to Moana, how does her conflict get resolved in the end of the story? What happens so that she's able to feel more free and that she keeps her island from dying? When you're writing that final summary, you're going to summarize key ideas from the beginning, the middle, and the end of the story. Okay, so if we were to look at summarizing a myth, again, identify important words, phrases, and events, eliminate minor details, restate big ideas in your own words, and connect your ideas with transitions like first, then, after, or finally. An example we're going to look at is again from Moana. So, Moana is an adventurous teenage girl who feels trapped on the island she was born on. When her island starts dying, she leaves to find a way to fix it. Along the way, she meets Maui, a demigod, who reluctantly helps her with the aid of his magical fish hook that allows him to change shape. Finally, despite the challenges of the journey, Moana gains the confidence to approach a goddess, make things right, and finally bring her family back to the ways of their ancestors. Okay, so it talks about key ideas and details you would need to understand the story, and then talks about the resolution of the conflict, and has transitions like finally and when or along the way. Okay, so we remember our I can statement. We want to be able to understand why a myth is told, identify the features of a myth, and summarize a story using a beginning, middle, and end. So we've talked about all those things right now, so we need to practice them, okay? So we're going to read a story about the Maasai people, which are people in Africa, East Africa along the Great Rift Valley. So if you look at this map, this is Africa, there's Kenya, and inside Kenya, kind of close to Nairobi, their capital, is where the lands where the Maasai live. There's about 500,000 people in the tribe, and they value farm animals, especially cows, which we're going to see featured in the story. They move around that area based on the seasons. So they don't stay in one area all year long like we might. They move based on the seasons because they rely especially on sun and rain to help with their crops and with their animals. Okay, so crops and animals cannot survive if there's too much rain or if there's too much sun. So they move based on that. And we're going to see those elements in the story as well. It's important to note that myths connect to a specific culture. Okay, so when we're reading our myths, we'll see traits of supernatural beings can show what the culture views as positive or negative traits. Natural phenomenons in myths might show what the climate, weather, or surroundings are like. All right, and interactions between humans and the supernatural might show cultural values or religious beliefs. In a minute, we're going to read the story. All right, so we're going to click on this link here in a minute. But as we read, we're going to look for mythical elements. So if we remember, our mythical elements are supernatural beings, so gods or human-like animals, fantasy settings, so places and things that don't exist in the real world. We're going to look and see if they try to explain the origin of the universe or why certain things happen the way they do. And we're going to look for conflicts between worlds, beings, yourself, or nature. We're also going to look for the central ideas and key details in the beginning, middle, and end of the story. All right, so if we are going to review that, remember at the beginning, we noticed key events, key ideas about the characters, setting, and conflict. In the middle of the story, we're noticing key ideas about how the conflict is building, so what the problem is and how it's developing. And then at the end, we are noticing key ideas about how the conflicts are resolved, or conflict is resolved. We also want to consider the overall purpose of the myth as we're reading that story. So if we remember what we talked about earlier, the potential purposes of a myth might be to entertain others, to warn about dangers, or to teach a lesson, to explain situations, or to share what's important to a culture, okay? So it could be any of these, could be the purpose of the myth. So we can always review back to this while we're reading. Review back to these key important slides or any of the slides. But for right now, we are going to look at this story, which is the beginnings of the Messiah, okay? So, I am the daughter of the great Nitirkab, the father of the Maasai tribe in Africa. You might think this makes me special, but my father believes that I should live just like the rest of the tribe. Thus, he sends me to look after our tribe's cattle with the other daughters and sons. These cattle are sacred because they're actually a divine gift from the sky god, Enkai. Our tribe makes a living by caring for the cattle, feeding them, and protecting them. Whenever we eat the meat of a cow or drink its milk, we become one with our God. See, that's a key belief from this tribe. When we have rituals or community celebrations, I have to bring the cattle because their presence is essential. My job is important, so I work hard to do it well, even though the cattle can sometimes be troublesome. Our relationship with Enkai is essential to the tribe. Enkai is neither male nor female. The sky god is powerful, but can change from nurturing to vengeful depending on our behavior. Sometimes Enkai is Enkai Narak, the black god, happy with us and blanketing the sky with dark clouds that pour out rain to nourish the plains. When angry, though, Enkai becomes Enkai Nanyoki, the red god. In these times, the sun grows incredibly hot, and the earth dries up and becomes barren. Because of this, we work to keep Enkai happy. So right here you see, based on the characteristics of their god, you know that they like it when dark clouds pour out rain to nourish the plains, all right? Because that's Enkai Narak, the black god, and he's happy with us when he gives the rain. But when he's Enkai Nanyoki, the sun is too hot and the earth dries up and becomes barren, and then they can't grow their crops or feed their cattle very well. Okay, so that's those beliefs. Continuing, my life must sound so different from yours. Perhaps I should tell you another story to explain why we Maasai live this way. In the very beginning of the world, Enkai was the only god, the guardian of rain, fertility, sun, and love. So you know that these are probably the four key things that this tribe especially values. With that love, Enkai birthed 3 sons who became the fathers of the 3 tribes. Enkai gave each tribe a gift to help them succeed in their new home. Upon the father of the Kikuyu, Enkai bestowed a hoe to cultivate the plains. And a hoe is just basically a farming tool. Okay? To the father of the Kamba, Enkai gifted a bow and arrow so his people could hunt wild animals in the forests and plains. To my father, Nitirkab, the father of the Maasai, Enkai gave a stick. Enkai told my father to use this to herd cattle. Do you know what that means? Not only is my father the father of our whole tribe, but my grandparent is the sky god. If only I inherited Enkai's ability to control the weather. Things would have remained peaceful this way, all of us tending to our cattle and living together with Enkai, if it hadn't been for the volcano. You see, soon after I was born, a massive volcano erupted right in the middle of the cattle plains. My father tells me the eruption was so violent it broke the earth away from the sky and flung Enkai and all of the cattle high up into the heavens. Imagine that, cows flying through the air. Every time my father tells me this, part of me wants to laugh a little. So there we see the conflict is developing. Cows, their sacred animal, get thrown into the sky by the volcano. But for our people, the Maasai, there wasn't anything funny about what happened. As the ruler of the sky, Enkai could live well enough up there, but the cattle couldn't survive in dusty volcanic clouds. The cows became parched and hungry up there. They had no solid earth for roaming and no grass for grazing. Enkai had to do something or risk losing his sacred herd. Enkai called down to Nitrikab, my father, and said, "Blessed father of the Maasai, my cattle are dying here in the clouds. There's nothing I can do to help them in the sky. I'm going to send them down to you so that you can keep them safe and sacred." Niederkab was confused at first. It was one thing for a volcanic eruption to send cows flying into the sky, but it was another problem entirely to get them down to earth again. But the wise God knew how to solve the problem. Enkai grew a giant fig tree out on the plains. One by one, Enkai sent the cattle walking down branches of the fig tree, all the way down to the roots at the ground. My father and our people accepted the cattle and began to herd them with the sticks Enkai had given us. Now, the rest of the tribe calls my father beginner of the earth because he mediates between Enkai and our tribe, just as he did when the cattle returned from the sky. When I was little, I used to climb in the giant fig tree with the other children, but it was so tall I couldn't reach very high. Now that I'm older, I can climb much farther, but I'll never find out if I could have climbed to heaven. You see, the tree is gone now. Neighboring hunters from the Kamba were jealous of Nichikab's special relationship with Enkai and the gift of our cattle. Out of vengeance, they hewed the fig tree into little pieces. It was heartbreaking to lose the strong bond with the sky god, but as long as we still have our cattle, we can still feel the joy of being connected to Enkai. Now, Enkai lives at the top of Mount Kenya, and we Maasai still live below, herding cattle in the plains. It's not a bad life, especially when Enkai is the black god, providing for us. And when the cattle or other children cause problems, I just warn them, they never know when I might suddenly develop my godly powers. Okay, so we read the story, the beginnings of the Maasai, and you'll be doing a quiz over all the things we talked about in our intro to mythology, okay? So you need to understand why a myth is told, be able to identify the features of a myth, and summarize a story using a beginning, middle, end model, okay? If you have any issues with that or just want to review any of the things we talked about, I will put a link under the video, and you should be able to review the story and any of the slides that we talked about. Thanks, guys. Let me know if you have any questions. Bye.